Any questions for Mr. Ramesh? Any comments, questions? No? In that case, do we?
There's a question.
I'm sorry. Yes, please go ahead.
So thank you, sir. I mean, I have to admit I haven't read the book, but I know something about B.K. Krishna Menon. But I was somewhat curious, what legacy did he have on and I'm sure Ambassador Dasgupta has something to say about this as well, on kind of the foreign service as an institution, right? Because he served as ambassador for kind of this formative period during the early years, during this transition. And he had this kind of, I mean, a lot of kind of the early ambassadors to key countries were very personalistic, kind of close to Nehru and all of this, right? And so, I mean, do you think he kind of helped or hindered the process of kind of more professionalization of kind of the foreign service in some senses? And did he have a legacy in terms of kind of mentees, people like Aksar and all who were either contemporaries or people who learned from him and they kind of took that tradition on a little bit?
Well, if we had, I think Ambassador Dasgupta is better positioned to answer Ambassador Rasgotra. Rasgotra is, but I can say, what I would say, my own view is that he didn't leave behind any system legacy in the foreign service, in terms of systems, right? He was not a systems man. He didn't respect hierarchy. He didn't respect command and control. He operated as a maverick. But I think the style of his diplomacy had a lingering effect in the Foreign Office. Both the style and the internationalization of India's policy. I mean, the fact that India was punching above its economic weight in the 50s was largely on account of Krishna Menon. It's on account of Nehru, of course. Without Nehru, Krishna Menon would not have been possible. But ultimately, it was Krishna Menon who was executing, and very often not just passively executing, but actually shaping India's international policies. So this internationalization of India's thinking, the fact that India has an important role to play in world affairs, whether it's in Africa, whether it's in the Middle East, whether it's in Southeast Asia. Of course, at that time, Middle East was not very important. Southeast Asia was very important. In Southeast Asia, I think these are some legacies which are directly attributable to Krishna Menon's tenure. But in terms of systems, I would be very hard put to identify. Of course, he coined the word non-alignment in 1953. So he didn't believe in non-alignment, by the way. He didn't like it one bit, but he used it in one of his speeches, and it became. He was not a great fan of the non-aligned movement either. You could see his discomfort. In the non-aligned movement, but he coined the word, and that, of course, then becomes a legacy as an idea. So in terms of substance, non-alignment, in terms of style, I think, the sharp, argumentative style with which generations of Indian diplomats have been associated, the felicity with which the English language was used, again, a hallmark of Indian diplomats. Krishna Menon epitomized that. So that style of his, the argumentative, combative style, not the deal-making style, but it was a combative, argumentative style, arguing on moral principles, arguing on first principles. If I may be permitted a very nasty aside at my chairman. My chairman adopted the Krishna Menon style in all climate change negotiations.
I see you adopted the Morarji Desai style.
Sorry, Your Majesty.
Not at all. Not at all. I wonder if Ambassador Rasgotra would like to share his thoughts.
I'm chairing this another day, so I'm hoping.
Okay. Right.
Except that as I was looking at him, I think he's beginning to look like Krishna Menon. I mean it. You have gone into the man so deeply. Your hairstyle is typical Krishna Menon. And I think your eyes are looking like Krishna Menon. Sharp.
Thank you, sir.
Of course, I think you are more handsome.
It's not a sheer coincidence that he called himself Sven name was Kautilya, right? It's not sheer coincidence that your pen name was Kautilya. No, I was just listening to you and Ambassador Gupta. You know, one can't but admire the sheer audacity of these people who played the global stage, coming from a country that was just newly independent, with a confidence and with the courage of conviction, without needing an entourage of performers to follow you around to give you, or your social bites to give you your sort of sense of presence on the global stage. But having said that, and despite commitment to Lasky and the Fabian sensibility, I wondered how much of a Democrat was Krishna Menon. Because even through his campaigns, you know that he doesn't have what's called the common touch. It's just his exalted status, intellectual superiority, in some ways even his Britishness, that kind of wins him the admiration and the awe of the Indian electorate. But how deeply committed in your new sort of
Well, it's a very tough question because unlike Nehru, Krishna Menon had very few opportunities for demonstrating his commitment to democracy in the real sense of the term. But I think, schooled as he was in the British Labour Party tradition, he was a member of the British Labour Party for years. I would say he was a democratic socialist, but more socialist than democrat. Nehru was also a democratic socialist, but more democratic than socialist. And I think they complemented each other very well in that regard. He supported the dismissal of the EMS Namboodiripad government in 1959. He's considered to be a god in Kerala, but the Keralites don't know that he is actually one of the key players in the 1959 drama. And he was not he didn't take Parliament as seriously as Nehru did. He was forced to take Parliament seriously because he was always the center of attacks by the socialists and the Bharatiya Janata Sangh and the Swatantra Party. But he would be patient. He would answer all of them like every good minister would do. But if you're asking me whether he truly was democratic in the way Nehru was, I wouldn't put him in that same class.
also in terms of the consultative process that they're having, I don't think he really
No, not too much. He said something, he would listen, then ultimately he would do exactly what he wanted to do. He was not Nehruvian in his democratic instincts. He was Nehruvian more in his socialist instincts in terms of economic policy. But on the other hand, he was not a communist. This canard that Menon was a communist, I have tried to debunk in every page. In fact, the best debunking of that comes in a Scotland Yard report. And Scotland Yard writes in one of its, he provided so much fodder for the MI5. MI5 guys would have been underemployed if Krishna Menon was not there. And in one report, it says that, while it's true that Krishna Menon takes full support from the British Communist Party for his movement for Indian independence, he's not a communist because he lacks the discipline to be one. So he was not a communist. But on the other hand, he was a left-leaning liberal Democrat, who believed in the superiority of what he was saying.
He lived a very ascetic sort of life, right? Not, you suggest his life was colorful, but he seems to have been extremely, almost ascetic in his personal.
His personal life was very ascetic, absolutely ascetic. Even the Jeep scandal, with which he is associated, other than in 1962, he doesn't make any money on it. Money is siphoned off by some of his buddies and it goes to support the India League. He doesn't make any money out of it. He lives a pretty abstemious life, barring his Savile Row suits and his designer mundus and kurtas and, angavastrams. He likes the good things of life. But, no, his he was ascetic. I mean, he led a simple life. It was not ostentatious. His life was not ostentatious. He was accessible. It's not as if he was not accessible. It was extraordinary. Two things that characterized his personality: his fondness for toys and his fondness for children. And I think that fondness of toys is a derivative of his fondness for children. So he was very accessible. People could go to him, you could talk to him. But being a Democrat means something else. I mean, I think to that extent, I think he was not in the same league as Nehru was.
May I just jog your memory? You mentioned that he supported the dismissal of the Namboodiripad government. In your book, if I recall correctly, you go one step further, that at the time of the reorganization of states, he actually opposed creating the state of Kerala because he foresaw that it was going to go to the communists.
Well, I must tell both these Keralite ladies, that he is considered to be a god in Kerala. But the fact is, he opposed the creation of Kerala in 1956 on the grounds that Kerala will become a red bastion. And he opposed the creation of an independent Madras on the grounds that it would become a bastion of linguistic fanaticism. And he writes this wonderful letter to Nehru saying that, this Kerala, if you allow Kerala, the communists will build a bastion there, it will become their citadel. Don't listen to these Malayalis asking for an independent Kerala. You know who he was referring to? He was referring to K.M. Panikka, who was then a member of the States Reorganization Commission, with whom he had a particularly rocky relationship.
General Banerjee?
Why did he have such a rocky relationship with the military, especially the senior generals of the army? What are the reasons why?
I tell you, this book is on a psychohistory. I don't get into psychology. It's just a narrative, archival account. But he's an eminent subject for a psychohistory. Let me speculate. The entire generation of armed forces that Krishna Menon was dealing with was the Paka Sahib, Sandhurst-educated guys. The only Sandhurst-educated Paka Sahib guy who was considered to be nationalist was B.M. Kaul. B.M. Kaul, if you remember, if I jog your memory a little, in 1946, Sardar Baldev Singh sets up an Armed Forces Nationalization Committee on how to accelerate the process of Indianization of the armed forces. And B.M. Kaul is the secretary of that committee. So B.M. Kaul is seen to be this nationalist in uniform, whereas Timaya, Karyappa, all these guys, Manekshaw, Rajendra Singh Ji, Thorat, Chaudhary, all of them as Thapar, all of them are considered to be the Britishers. I think that was one very important factor that created a gap between Krishna Menon and that generation of the armed personnel. Secondly, the argument that Ambassador gave, the armed forces respect two things. They respect hierarchy and they respect clear chain of command. Krishna Menon didn't believe in that. He would reach down to the bottom of the hierarchy in order to get information. And as he said, he would tell, he told an ICS officer, I thought it was an apocryphal story, but I actually found it in one of his letters. He actually told an ICS officer in a meeting with armed forces generals, O. Pulla Reddy was the great O. Pulla Reddy was the defense secretary, and some proposal was not seeing the light of day. And in front of Timaya and in front of Katari and in front of Air Marshal Mukherjee, who was then, the Air Force, he tells Pulla Reddy, he says, what sort of an officer are you? You neither pull nor are you ready. What Pulla Reddy are you? So he would, routinely insult people. For him, it was not insult. For him, it was, it was conversation. Shashi Tharoor has this wonderful story. Shashi Tharoor's father worked with him for many years. So Chandran Tharoor had a heart attack and he was in hospital in Bombay. So Krishna Menon went to call on him. And instead of commiserating with Mr. Tharoor, senior, first thing he says is, I say, Chandran, you've had a heart attack. It's the first time I've discovered you have a heart. So this is the way you can do this in other ministries, but in the defense ministry, you have systems, you have hierarchies, you have a clear chain of command. And I think that is what he did not believe in. And that led to a big gap. By the way, some of his greatest supporters are army officers. All the army officers in Hindustan Aeronautics, in all the defense production guys, were all swear by Krishna Menon. The DRDO people swear by Krishna Menon. Kalam, when he was president, made sure that a report came out on DRDO, and one chapter was on Krishna Menon and DRDO. So it's not as if in the defense forces he doesn't have his... I think the 62 thing really set the clock back. Yes, sir.
All wars are fought twice. The first time with the sword, the second time with the pen. And we've heard from the generals about 1962. We still have to hear from historians like yourselves, about ultimately, why the war was lost.
So
and
there
the
is a
larger
wonderful
reasons.
quote from Jaishankar's father, which I discovered in the book. Jaishankar's father was asked in 88 about what happened in 62. And Mr. Subramaniam said that it was a military failure. It was a failure of military leadership, which the military conveniently transferred to the political leadership. Of course, the political leadership had its share of mistakes, but it would be completely unwise to absolve the military of its responsibilities in 1962. This is Subramaniam who said this in 62. Absolutely, sir. Very clear. Yeah, it was a comprehensive national failure.
Sir, you wanted to...
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. First of all, I would like to say I feel very comfortable speaking in Hindi if you allow me to. That's one thing. जयराम जी, मुझे सिर्फ इतना ही कहना है कि मेरा उनसे ज़्यादा इनकाउंटर नहीं हुआ. मैं बचपन से ही उनको सुनता रहा जब मैं इंडिया में था. बाद में जब चला गया विदेश में तो उनसे संपर्क करने का, वहाँ भी सुनने का, उनसे मिलने का भी अवसर हुआ था. मैं परसीव करता हूँ अक्सर से भी कुछ समय के लिए मेरा ये कहना है आपने उनको कैप्चर किया बुक में. मेरा ये अपना मानना है कि एज ए परसीव पर्सनैलिटी इन पीपल एंड सिचुएशंस माय स्टडी इज दैट यू कैन कैप्चर ए पर्सनैलिटी लाइक दैट इन एनी यू कैन बॉक्स इन ए बुक. उसको पकड़ना और बंद करना किसी तालीम में इतना आसान नहीं है. ये मेरा अपना तजर्बा. आज तक मैं ड्रीम से मैं उसको पकड़ने की कोशिश करता हूँ. पकड़ना मुश्किल है बिकॉज वो फिसलता ही चला जाता है. वो फिसलने वाला आदमी जो एवोल्यूशन को फॉलो करता है. ये चीज ये चलता दौर है. इसको संभालो, खत्म करो, आगे बढ़ो. ये
मैंने पकड़ने की
आपको
छोड़ दिया है.
अच्छा मैंने
आप पढ़िए, आप पकड़िए. मेरा मकसद नहीं है पकड़ना.
मैंने अपने जीवन में कोई किताब नहीं पढ़ी, 2 पढ़ी. एक चैप्टर है लेडी चैप्टर इज लवर एंड Krishna Menon's book you just might appreciate the word view about that I happened to buy over there. I saw it on the shelf and buy it. That's only 2 books I read. And incidentally I read, just I don't know, it's not someone did. But एक चीज मैं लास्ट क्वेश्चन कहूँगा. उनके जो क्रिटिक्स हैं, मैंने जी के जो क्रिटिक्स हैं, मैं उन जिस परिवार के साथ को संबंध रहा गांधी जी का उनका जोहान्सबर्ग से क्या नाम साउथ अफ्रीका से माइंड डायमंड डीलर्स जिनके साथ ये रहे और जो लंदन में उनके साथ संपर्क में उनका कई गेस्ट रहा उनके घर में तो वो उनके बारे में सब कुछ बता देते थे मुझे वो क्या करते थे कैसे आते थे जाते थे. जो उनके क्रिटिक है उनके लिए मैं एक लफ्ज कहना चाहता हूँ. आपने उनके बारे में बहुत पढ़ा. जब वो उनका अंत समय आया तो उनके पास कितने असेट्स थे. व्हाट वर द असेट्स? धोती, कपड़ा, वो किताब और किताबें. इसके अलावा जो आदमी जो मिलियन बना सकता था एक खूंटी के सहारे चला गया और वो लोग उसको और you can't catch him on a wrong foot anywhere in his life. That's what I say. If you want to catch him on a wrong foot, I'll face him.
Thank you.
I'll face him.
Thank you. Yes.
Briefly, can you recall some of the speeches of V.K. Krishna Menon during the China war? A long debate has taken place on white paper and other. Can you just recall about his role in parliament debate?
Well, there is his most famous speech in Parliament is in the first no confidence motion. that was moved by Acharya Kripalani in August of 1963. And the last speaker from the government side before the Prime Minister spoke was Krishna Menon. Because the no confidence motion was brought by Acharya Kripalani, Ram Manohar Lohia and Minu Masani on the grounds that 1962 had betrayed India. That was the grounds of the no confidence motion. And the House expresses no confidence in Mr. Nehru's cabinet. So Krishna Menon spoke for almost 2 hours that day. That is his most comprehensive speech. It's available on the Lok Sabha archives. You can read it. And that is where he demolishes Kripalani by quoting what Kripalani said from 1952 to 1962 on defense spending and turning the argument on its head, saying those who are accusing me of underinvesting in defense were the people arguing for low spending in defense in the 50s. So that is his most famous speech. The other speech that he gives is on the 20th of October 1962 at Ramlila Maidan, which I have quoted in the book, you will see. That is the speech, that was the evening of that was the night on which the China had invaded India for the first time. China invaded in 2 spells. The first spell was on the 20th of October. That evening, Krishna Menon speaks in a big rally in Ramlila Maidan. He speaks in English, okay, but heard in pin-drop silence and cheer. Because the reverses had not yet taken place. It comes much later. So these are the 2 speeches that he gives on China. Incidentally, a lot of his UN speeches now are available on YouTube. Those of you who are interested can go to YouTube. About 60 of his UN speeches are now available. Short speeches. Some of them are, short excerpts, 8-minute, 10-minute, 12-minute. But you get a sense. And some of his press conferences are now available. So, it's a lot of things are coming out of the archives, particularly in the UN. And I think in his Indian speeches, I would say this 1963 speech is the most remarkable.
Sir, during that motion in 63, Nehru must have spoken also, no? In the end, just before V.K. Krishna.
Sorry,
Nehru.
Yes, Nehru spoke at the end. Nehru did speak at the end, but Nehru didn't speak much. The bulk of the defense of the government was done by Krishna Menon. Incidentally, nobody in the Congress party wanted Krishna Menon to speak. He went to Nehru and said, please allow me to speak. So Nehru then allowed him to speak. He became the second last speaker. Nehru speaks after, but Nehru, by tradition in a no confidence motion, the Prime Minister has to speak at the end. He spoke at the end, didn't speak too long. The bulk of the defense was done by Krishna Menon, just before his speech.
Sorry, we've run out of time. We've run out of time. We've given you time. We've run out of time. I think it only remains for me to thank Mr. Ramesh for this brilliant presentation and to encourage all of you to pick up a copy of his book and to educate yourself.
Apologies.
Not at all.
Thank you both. Thank you very much, Ambassador, for such fantastic conversation.